You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
The whole world has been watching as a major humanitarian crisis erupted in the war-torn country of Afghanistan. Spurred by US President Joe Biden's decision to pull US troops out of the Afghan soil, Taliban terrorists took over the country swiftly with little to no resistance and returned to power. What was left behind was a hapless people, unsure of where their futures lie and scared of what comes with the Taliban regime, which is known for its extremities. In what will perhaps remain to be the defining image of the tragedy that befell Afghanistan, hundreds of Afghan nationals were seen streaming into Kabul and thronging around the tarmac of Kabul airport as photos and video footage showed in a bid to escape the country. But with no way out, some of them were simply clinging onto flights without hopes of ever fleeing. And amid this reign of chaos and fear, Taliban insurgents have been taking control of province after province in the past week until they finally marched into the capital Kabul, which was the last major seat of the Afghan government, and claimed victory. Barely hours after President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, the Taliban also seized the presidential palace and, brandishing guns, they declared that the war is over. Indeed, the war against terror that had started 20 years back with the US sending its troops to the country to topple over the Taliban regime ended in the same place that it had started, with the Taliban rule. And just like that, in a matter of few months, Afghanistan's political and social future went through what can only be described as a tectonic shift. But how did Taliban insurgency withstand 20 years of US offense against them and capture Afghanistan once again? Is the decision to withdraw US troops going to define Biden's legacy? What is the fate of people and women especially who are trying to escape the Taliban rule? Starting today with the next few episodes of our daily news podcast, we will try to unravel the nuances of what led to the fall of Afghanistan and the many implications of this political catastrophe. In this episode, we will look at what happened in the last 20 years that ultimately led to the Taliban marking the end of the US Army era in the country. Did the US lose the narrative of the battle against Taliban and the Al-Qaeda forces? Was it really invested in the peace process? And how did Afghan forces fall so easily into the hands of Taliban? Our guests for today's episode are Kriti Shah, Associate Fellow in the Department of Strategic Studies at the Observer Research Foundation, and Mr. Anil Trigunayath, former Indian envoy to Jordan, Libya and Malta. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you. And I'm your host, Shorburi. In April this year, US President Joe Biden announced his decision to withdraw US troops and end what is perhaps the country's longest modern war. He said that the US had spent $1 trillion of taxpayers' money over the last 20 years to strengthen Afghan forces, and now the country's people would have to fight for the nation on their own. And so, taking the Taliban's word that they would engage in a peaceful transfer of power, the US troops began exiting. But no sooner did they start leaving, the Taliban made shockingly fast advances despite being vastly outnumbered by the Afghan forces, and that triggered a global concern of an impending humanitarian disaster that is likely to unfold in the coming days. If in April the Taliban took 73 out of the country's 421 districts under its control, by August they had established their rule in more than half of the country's districts. In fact, in just the past weekend, the Taliban took over some of the country's major provincial capitals such as Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, as the Ghani government desperately clung to power. But how did the Taliban forces outlast the US offense against them over the last 20 years and usurp power so quickly? It's not any one single event that led to the resurgence of Taliban in Afghanistan. The present state of the country is a product of years of war, terrorism, foreign policies and geopolitical rivalries. And the US certainly takes a lead role in the story. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in New York, the then US President George W. Bush had vowed to win the war against terrorism. And although the attackers were Al-Qaeda operatives and none of them Afghan nationals, Osama bin Laden, who was identified as the leader of the terrorist outfit, was being sheltered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Islamist terrorist group, which had seized control over the country since 1996 after a decade-long period of Soviet occupation, refused to hand bin Laden over to the US And that's how Bush set out to battle it out against both Taliban and the Al Qaeda forces on war footing. While bin Laden slipped out of the country into Pakistan, NATO allies and the Northern Alliance, which was an anti Taliban military front, joined in the US led a front against the Taliban. And finally, in 2001, the terrorist group was toppled over and Hamid Karzai was made the new president. In the last 20 years, even though money and military equipment and thousands of US army troops were injected into Afghanistan to fortify the offensive against the Taliban, it failed to vanquish the Taliban forces. Close to 2,500 American lives, along with at least 150,000 Afghan lives, have been lost waging this war. But the Taliban insurgents have been bouncing back off and on with car explosions and suicide attacks. And then suddenly the US decided that its war is over. Somewhere down the line, in the shifting strategies of different US governments, did the US lose its battle narrative that enabled the Taliban to outlast its forces? Kriti Shah believes that the US has been confused about what they define as winning the war.
Yes, so the US has definitely lost the, in a war in general, the narrative or the propaganda of both sides is very important. And the US has had arguably the weaker narrative in Afghanistan. Now, what I mean by that is that the US has been a little confused about what do they define as winning the war. Does winning the war mean that the Taliban no longer exist? Does winning the war mean that Al Qaeda and Taliban are no longer going to be in Afghanistan? Does winning the war mean setting up of a government? So they've sort of had these shifting goalposts, and through the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, and now Biden administration, there has been a lot of difference on how do we decide that we have won and therefore leave. And because of that confusion amongst the US, that has given the strength to the Taliban. Because from day one, they have been saying that we want to establish an Islamic emirate. So they have laid down their red line and they have not deviated from that.
When the US had started its offense in Afghanistan, they began with a very clear motive to get Osama bin Laden out of Afghanistan. But while Bush got distracted with Iraq, even after bin Laden's death in a US raid in Pakistan's Abbottabad, the US stayed on in Afghan soil, lending its support to a proxy government. And that was the biggest loss of the US narrative in this long war, Mr. Anil Trigunayat says.
Well, it has to be looked into a historical perspective as well. You see, when the US forces or US government decided to chase the Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, they unilaterally wanted to just go and bomb the place. The whole world's sympathy was with them, right? But their objective was only to degrade Al Qaeda somehow and degrade its leadership, which they said they were successful. And after 10 years, they also killed Osama bin Laden. But in the process, as Biden himself has said, that our position was not that we are not going there for nation building. Now, that has been their biggest loss of narrative. If you cannot remain in a country and be an occupying power and then try to create a sort of a proxy. So anybody, the Afghan government was not really accepted by all the people because Taliban at the end of the day are also Afghans, right? So if a large cross section of people are not accepting you the way you are or you want to be, so therefore you are simply using these Afghan government or the people as a tool.
But the way the Taliban insurgents captured the country in lightning speed has taken many people by surprise. Theoretically, with almost 3 lakh soldiers in the Afghan forces, they easily outnumber the Taliban fighters. Not to mention the amount of time and money and the billions of dollars spent on training the Afghan forces by the advanced Western allies. Moreover, justifying the withdrawal of US troops, President Biden had earlier even said that there was no likelihood of Afghanistan being overrun. Other American assessments also claimed that Taliban forces would not be able to target Kabul before a month. So then, how did the Taliban gain ground so quickly? Kriti Shah explains that the Taliban strategy has been to start small and seize rural areas and occupy isolated outposts and steadily make gains on major population areas.
So the Taliban's military strategy has been pretty much the same throughout, which is that they have been seizing rural areas, so small villages that seem insignificant on the larger scale, small districts. They've been seizing that since 2015, and then steadily making gains on major population centers. In the last few months, what they have done is that they have focused on key areas where they believed that they would have found resistance. So, such as northern Afghanistan, where you have the typical power brokers and international actors in the 90s had supported actors in the north to fight the Taliban. So, by securing the north, taking control of those provinces, and cutting off the support that they could receive from Kabul, their strategy has been very successful. Because once you capture all the smaller areas, it's easier for you to gain on the provincial capital. Now, the Afghan security forces, yes, their strength has definitely been overestimated by everyone, including me. Um, Everyone did believe that, yes, they're going to put up a fight. Yes, they're going to fight heroically. There's no way that this can happen. What has happened now is the worst case scenario.
But it's not just one factor or the other that contributed to the surprisingly weak defense put up by the Afghan military. Rather, it's a combination of wide-ranging factors. As the Taliban advanced, a big factor that contributed to the fall of Afghanistan was the fact that along with the withdrawal of US forces, a lot of its advanced technical and intelligence support, its planes and its helicopters were also not available to the Afghan troops anymore. Other reasons would be the dependence on a small number of elite forces and warlords and local militias to defend against the Taliban insurgents. But characterized with mass desertion and demoralization, the Afghan forces soon caved. Was their strength merely an overestimation then to justify the exit of the US troops? Ms. Shah elaborates more on why the Afghan soldiers couldn't match up to the Taliban.
But it's also important to remember that they did put up a fight. It's not that everywhere the situation was the same. Their official numbers, I think the Afghan government says that there are about 300,000 Afghan forces. But that's a huge number, and there are not that many forces on the ground. I think it's about half of that, and about only 60% of them are combat forces. All this time, they have had the support of US air power as well, which has been helping them make gains against the Taliban, or to at least win back territory that the Taliban has captured. But yes, they do suffer from an extremely high casualty rate. There's extremely low morale given the situation. There is corruption in the Afghan forces. They have major reinforcement and supply problems. There's not enough rotation of forces where, people can go back home, get the rest, and then come back to serve. And that's a problem. So how do you defeat the Taliban when, even if they're almost at the same number of you, the Afghan government, because of the US pressure on them, has been releasing more Taliban prisoners from their jails every day? How do you defeat the Taliban when you cannot cut them off at the source, where their main logistics bases, where their main training hubs are across the border in Pakistan?
Mr. Trigunayat also points out that a few other factors, such as rampant corruption, erratic payment of soldier and police salaries, and the dearth of political and military leadership could have also contributed to the easy takeover of the country by the Taliban.
You see, there are many theories about it, actually. And I can only say, because I have not been on the ground, so I can only say what I have discussed or read about a lot of theories. Number one is that there has been a dearth of political and the military leadership in Afghanistan. They could not even have a defense minister for a long time. You can imagine. Commanders were not there in place. And it seems that the Taliban and the people, those Afghans and all, they have been corrupted quite a lot, in the process. The corruption has been rampant, even though funds have been coming in, but there's a lot of corruption. Thirdly, the Americans created this army for essentially counterterrorism. It was not for fighting, whereas for Taliban, it was a fight all along. They've been fighting wherever they could in a guerrilla warfare. They're supported by Pakistan, by Iran, by many other countries in the region. So they know it, that how to go and capture the territory. Then only thing during this time, they have become far more suave, far more intelligent. So the territory, I think that even their estimations, that's what I mentioned, the estimations of how much territory they control, like rural areas, they thought it is nothing much. Okay, we can just retain some of the major towns. The major towns also fell like a pack of cards. We have seen it. And it happened because a lot of people there were negotiating throughout, knowing the Taliban is a terrorizing organization. So everybody is scared of their violence, the methods of violence. I think that has really scared them out. Thirdly, a lot of soldiers were not even paid their salaries for months together. So, so many people thought that it was better the Taliban takes over. At least there is some kind of an equanimity in that system.
After releasing a televised message where Ashraf Ghani pledged to prevent further violence and bloodshed, he and his ministers packed up and left. As the fate of the country's citizens now fall into Taliban hands, many people who fear Taliban oppression in the coming days are feeling abandoned by Ghani's government, which brings in the question of why has the US-backed regime collapsed so easily? In the last decades, although they were occasionally marred with Taliban-led explosions and attacks across the country, the Afghan government's presence ensured that to a large extent, a generation of Afghani youth grew up without the oppression of the fundamentalist Taliban regime that had banned music and movement of unchaperoned women, among other things. However, the country's overall development was largely stunted and hollowed out by massive corruption. According to reports, often local warlords and government jobs would look away from corruption, and even though cash flowed, the money never reached the people, Mr. Trigunayat says. In 2014, Ghani rode into power with promises of developing Afghanistan, but did little to check the rampant corruption. And that slowly waned the support for the Afghan government as well.
Of course, I mean, corruption was one of the major factors. And everybody says who has been watching that all these, the actual money which was supposed to go down to the people did not reach them, right? Whatever little development you can see there is mainly done by India. I mean, which in the last 20 years, and a lot of these projects that we have done, which have and capacity building assistance. The US has also invested hugely about $1 trillion or whatever, but not for the development of the nation per se. They were trying to develop certain institutions which have become irrelevant in the system when you just dump them. So that is the thing. So their corruption is tremendous. And of course, the drug money that the Taliban has, they got a lot of money out of drug. Now they have controlled all access, everything. So all the revenue will come to them. So they are not short of funds or anything. Plus, in any case, countries like Iran, whom you have been sanctioning all along, the Western countries, they are their neighbors and they've been providing them whatever assistance was necessary, including the arms ammunition. So last time Taliban was not on the good books of Iran, but this time they've been talking. So everybody has been talking to Taliban in that sense, so legitimizing their aspirations and therefore their confidence and resolve that they can take over, and they have taken over.
But as the US's exit from Afghanistan left the country in utter jeopardy, it is making many people question what the US government's commitments to security and the rule of democracy really mean. The weakened Afghan government and its military aside, the bulk of the responsibility also falls on the US for undermining the Afghan government's position in the peace talks with the Taliban. While the terrorist group, which considers the Ghani government to be a puppet of the US, has long avoided holding direct talks with them, the US governments had for a long time refused to hold direct dialogues with the Taliban forces without the presence of the Afghan government. But all that quickly changed under the Trump presidency. As the US officials engaged the Taliban, the Afghanistan government was shoved to the sidelines of the peace talks. And although the Taliban said that they would be committed to making provisions for an inclusive government and consider the rights of women and minorities, they barely had any proposal beyond the fact that they were seeking to establish an Islamic system. But without strong assurances from the Taliban, the US decided to go ahead and withdraw its troops anyway. Was the country really invested in the peace process at all? Ms. Shah weighs in.
So it depends on how, of course, you decide whether they're invested. They were invested to the point that they were eager to have a deal so that they can leave. They were not eager to have a deal so that Afghanistan is protected forever, because that is a highly, sort of delusional and very, very optimistic outcome, which I think the US knew that would not be possible. So even when they began the peace agreement, knowing that they are negotiating with the Taliban, yes, there are difficulties which come along with it, but there are also so many problems with the agreement which have led to the situation today. There was nothing in the agreement which the US could sort of hold over the Taliban or say that, this is how we bind you to this agreement. So if you don't do this, then we will have to do this. Their basic negotiations with the Taliban, what it comes down to is Washington saying, look, we're going to leave Afghanistan. All you need to do is that you need to make sure that you no longer shelter Al-Qaeda and you no longer shelter any group that will use Afghanistan as a base to attack the United States. Can you promise us that? And if you can promise us that, we will leave. And then you begin negotiations with the Afghans on how to negotiate an end to the war. So the US likes to call it a peace deal when it was not a peace deal. It was a deal which helped them withdraw. And the Taliban can say whatever they want. They can say that, yeah, of course, we're not going to let Al-Qaeda attack you. Yes, we're not going to do this. But there's nothing, how are you going to hold them to that promise? You would be gone. So those were the major problems in the peace deal, which people have been highlighting. for since last February. But the US did not take seriously, because they said, when we talk to the Taliban, they are sure that they're not going to do this, and this is not going to happen. So it was a major problem in the peace deal, and those sort of cracks which always existed have now sort of just split wide open, and now there's nothing that you can do.
Now, as the terrorist outfit waits to quote-unquote peacefully take over the governance, several countries, including the US, are scrambling to evacuate embassy officials and other citizens who are in danger. And despite many people still being stuck in the country, the Afghan airspace has been closed for commercial flights from 16th August onwards, after it was declared uncontrolled by authorities at the Kabul airport. And due to this, a scheduled Air India flight from Delhi to Kabul was also cancelled. But as the fate of Afghan people hang in the balance, will this prove to be a disastrous legacy for the Biden government? Stay tuned to the Quint for more stories on the Afghanistan crisis. If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story playlist for episodic updates. We're live on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website and check out the podcast section. For any feedback, shoot an email to podcasts@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.